Okay, I think it's 7 o'clock. Welcome everybody to this meeting of Audit and Governance. I can direct you to the agenda. And first of all, we have apologies for absence.
We have apologies from Councillor Crofton, Huggins and Alder.
Thank you. Item 2 on the agenda is the minutes from the last meeting, which was held on the 31st of May. Are members who attended at that meeting happy to read them as a correct record? Thank you. Got a proposer and a seconder. All those in favour? Thanks, it's carried. Thank you. Chairman's announcements. I'd just like to remind everybody to use their microphones as this meeting is being webcast. I'd also like to mention, I understand that Nick Jennings has been taken ill today, and I think this committee would wish him a very speedy recovery, and our very best wishes for that. Thank you. And we welcome Darren Barlow, who's very kindly stepped in to take the training and also to present the reports from the Shared Anti-Fraud Service. Thank you. I don't believe there are any other announcements.
Oh,
I did the microphones.
Oh, sorry.
Declarations of interest. Any declarations of interest? No. Okay, thank you. No declarations of interest to note. That brings on to training. Darren, thank you. Welcome. Thank you.
Good evening, Chair. Good evening, members. I'm just going to stand up because it's easy to present, I think, whilst I'm standing and explaining what fraud is all about this evening. If for any reason the microphone isn't working properly, let me know and I'll adjust what needs to be sorted. Yes, thank you very much for inviting myself. Nick sends his profuse apologies. He's rather indisposed, but well on the mend, which is good news. So I'm one of two counter fraud managers at the Shared Anti-Fraud Service. Nick is the head of service, and I have responsibility for not only this council but also Stevenage, which is very good because we have the shared partnership in the Revs and Ben service. Also North Hearts, geographically located near to yourselves, and also Luton, which is a bit random, but there's good reason for that as well.
So you look after four sort of authorities?
Four authorities, yes. And we, with the exception of Luton, where we have more staff, we have one member of staff. But I'll come on to that in the report.
Sure, thank you.
So, fraud. The next slide, please. I rather like this image. A, for the image itself, and also the phrase that's in there. Fraud and deceit are anxious for your money. Be informed and prudent. Mr. Woodstow was a Norwegian-born American, and if I tell you that he died in 1952 at the age of 80, this phrase still has resonance today. You talk about the urgency of the bank fraud, where people phone you up. You think of the email scams and spoof requests that come around. I used to work for someone that used to say there's nothing really new in fraud, and to be honest with you, there isn't. There's an alteration of different ways of committing the fraud, but at the end, we can see that back in at least the 50s, if not earlier, when Mr. Woodstow made this comment, it was still relevant as much then as it is today. And I quite like the image that sits behind it, because we're on a never-ending road. And as we're carrying on down that road, coming out of the woods either side are those people that want to take money from us. So the be informed and prudent is a good lesson for us all to maintain. There's three questions up on that slide. I'm not going to ask anyone for answers. Obviously, it's been webcast, and also people actually might feel a bit embarrassed about saying they've been the victim of fraud, because that's generally what most people think. I've been the victim of fraud. I've been had. I've been duped. I was really silly. I was really stupid. If we talk about businesses, councils even, who are in the business of being a council, what's the perception? Slightly different, I would suggest. A lot of people would say, well, actually, that's a business. They've got money. They're a bank. They're likely to be the victim of fraud. It's not their fault. They're just stupid, or something's gone wrong, or there's an issue. And that difference in an individual to an institution shouldn't be there. Fraud is fraud. Whoever's committed it, it's wrong, and it's depriving an institution, such as a council, from providing vital services, as we know. Next slide, please. The image on the left is Mr. Cressey's triangle, Dr. Donald Cressey's four triangle, and it explains quite succinctly why fraud occurs and what's behind it happening. So opportunity, justification, financial pressure. So opportunity, a system, a process has gone wrong, or it didn't exist. It allowed the fraud to happen. Someone didn't comply with that system or policy because they were too busy. It was something else going on and it just didn't happen as it should have done. Those opportunities sleep through through all the time. And getting back to an individual or an institution, an individual will say, I was really silly at work today. I fell for a scam email. Not that they were being targeted, along with many other people out there, every day of the year by organised fraudsters over an email network. So that opportunity arises because something usually has gone wrong or is not there to prevent. Justification. Sometimes it's about an individual basis as well. So an individual will be considering why it's right to do it. Well, it's only the council's money. They've got plenty and they'll get more from government. So if I don't tell the truth on an application form for some assistance, what does it matter? The financial pressure, there's lots of pressures on everybody financially, especially currently. But there's other things. It's not just being desperate because you've lost your job or you can't keep up with payments even though you're in work. There's addiction, gambling, drugs, alcohol that drives the fuel for needing more money. If Nick were here, he would probably just sum it up by saying, is it just greed and need? Where is the motivation for people doing it? And sometimes on the left, there's the opportunist, there's the person rationalising it and there's a need. And on the right, it's somebody that went, you know, that's my job. I'm a criminal and that's what I do, a career criminal. And they are out there too, the organised criminal networks that you hear so much about. Just to put this in very quick context, in a restaurant, group of people, meal finishes, the bill comes round and there's always one person that wants to look at the bill. There's a bottle of wine, a round of drinks, a couple of dishes that have been missed off. Again, because the person waiting at the table has still got the tickets in their apron or has given it to the bar didn't give it to the cashier, there's a problem, something's gone wrong somewhere. Who puts their hands up and says, excuse me, you've missed off the bottle of wine, you've missed off the round of drinks, you've missed off the couple of dishes. The opportunity was there, the justification is, well, it's their fault, they should have known better, and I'm not saying anything. But is there a financial pressure? Possibly not. So we don't always see these things. Next slide, please. These are two publications that Nick will implore you to read. And at the end of our report, the next item on the agenda later, there's quite a long list of some bedtime reading. And I'll come to one of them in a minute. But the Fighting Fraud and Corruption Locally gives us these pillars where they're all important, but for me, we have to acknowledge, we have to know that we've got a problem, or there may be a problem. We have to try and prevent those problems occurring, and if we can't prevent them, we need to go after the people that have committed fraud against us and protect the rest of the finances and act as a deterrent with that pursual aspect. We can protect more fraud occurring. And of course, the govern bit is about those processes, the policies, the systems, making sure that fraud does not occur. The CITFA publication is there, Culture, Technology, Resources Prevention, and they are both good reads. Next, please. We started printing some of these. This is a pre-COVID version, so it's probably a little bit out of date. The link is on the screen. It's Nick would definitely say it's a must read for a councillor, a member. It's not, as you can see, as an O5, it's not very big, and it's really straightforward and a nice, easy reference book. But the link's there, and I understand the slides are being shared, so that can be freely available, not just members for this committee, but all members of the council. Next, please. This is who SAFs are in a simple slide. It is a partnership. We all work for each other. As you can immediately see, and as I alluded to at the very beginning, this council was very close to North Hants Council. It's very close to Stevenage Council. Geographically, there might be a good reason why we're working for both councils on one case at the same time. It wouldn't surprise you to know that Clarion and Catalyst have got properties in your council area. So working for them is good too for the council in terms of the waiting list and the management of housing applications. So a partnership in the truest sense of the word. Next slide, please. Last year, I'll come on to it a bit in the report, but this is just a flavour of some of the work, the assurance that SAF's provided in relation to the business grants, which have been widely reported in the press. I'll just leave that there. There has been some fraud. We moved to a prevent phase as soon as this started to, we knew that these grants were coming out because we knew the issues and the concerns that partners had, and were able to mobilise some of the resource away from the investigation so we could get into that prevent aspect, that prevent pillar to try and stop it coming out. And I'm pleased to say, generally speaking, we had a great response to that. And in cases where things did go slightly wrong, more often than not, those cases were investigated and some led to the recovery of the money back as well, and some more for other councils who were completely unaware. So that's good stuff. Next, please. We work jointly with all sorts of industry bodies. DWP had difficulties during COVID for obvious reasons, withdrawn away from working jointly with us. We're now back into one of their main offices, and actually that's more streamlined, it's more efficient, and it's more effective, and we're getting responses back within a week as opposed to investigations and processes that could take a month or two. So we get those responses back quickly, and the money gets stopped earlier, and when it's being paid incorrectly, and that's a win for everybody looking after the public purse. As mentioned earlier, some of our partners are up there. We work with Herts Police. We've used them to effect search warrants where we don't have a power to search for evidence of offending. And Herts Police, just next door to us at the police station, actually a team there very recently come out with us. Industry bodies put out lots of alerts, and I'll mention it again probably very shortly, but we circulate all those alerts, put the information out there to the relevant teams within the authority to make sure they're picked up and being dealt with. Yeah, next slide, please. So our capabilities are nicely depicted in this cog, somewhat similar to the pillars of prevent, pursue. This is detection, response, and prevention. As I said earlier, if we can detect something and deal with it appropriately, we can do a media campaign and say, look, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. And that also drives more people to report fraud to us as well. So there's a double benefit. So we're looking for where the fraud is. We don't just rely on referrals coming to us. There's some data matching and intelligence tools working in the background, national and bespoke to the SAFs partnership. Our response is governed by legislation in this, that everybody uses in this country. The Police and Criminal Evidence Act, the disclosure, and all of those things, we work with those, and specific pieces of legislation regarding council tax and housing. And so when we get a detection, we get a response, we deal with that, we get that prevention effect where we can provide risk assessments and explain why it went wrong and say, you need to plug that gap. We can get the press coverage, the media campaigns out there, and we've also got this awareness and training that we all run out. So all of this is all interlinked. There's nothing, to use a word that I don't particularly like, it's holistic in that sense. Just because something has happened, just doesn't mean it sits there once it's been to court or the disposal has been reached. We look to bring that back in and say, this is why, this is what we can do, and this is the things to be looking for. Next, please. There we go. In action. So this has got two case studies. They're not from this authority, first thing to say, but they do give a good feel of the type of work that we do all the way across the partnership. And the reason we've chosen these is because they've got different bits to it that are actually really good for us and things you may not be aware of. So this is about an internal threat, a member of staff who works in the council tax department and was receiving payments from local residents over the telephone, and they were paying excess council tax or settling their council tax bills using their debit cards. The analysis showed when a number of people started to complain about their card being misused after they paid some money at the council, that one person was responsible for processing those transactions. We went out and spoke to all those individuals and looked at what was going on, made sure that there was no other commonality in those bank statements where they could have all used, because they live locally, they could have all gone into the same shop or somewhere else. So we had to eliminate that as well. So we took that away, and we were still left with potentially a worst case scenario with an inside threat. We then contacted the businesses where the transactions were made, mainly leisure based, hotels, bars, takeaway, food like that. And we asked, can you give some details about who made these purchases? They gave us the mobile telephone numbers and the IP address of the computer or the log on that someone used to make those purchases, which we then were able to link to and resolve down to the member of staff. Just to make doubly sure, we use a piece of legislation called IPA, which is the new piece of legislation that runs alongside RIPA, Investigatory Powers Act. This just sits on its own and relates to mobile telephone data and how to obtain it and what governs how we can get hold of that. So we did that, and we looked at the person's telephone history, and not only did we find the retailers that we identified as fraud transactions, we could place that individual near to where those orders were being made at about the right time. So employee was interviewed internally and dismissed for gross conduct, and we have a prosecution case pending. And when we went back to the authority and said, look, this is what the whole of the story was, controls and issues and a fraud risk assessment was given to them, and they could make their own decision about how they then implemented the findings. Next, please. Social housing provider, one of the ones that we work with, obviously, in a district not dissimilar to this, couldn't get in and deal with their compliance under the gas safety checks and deal with electrical pack testing. It happens every year, and persistent attempts to get in were being refused, and they're compelled to make sure that they do these tests. Obviously, the gas safety at any property is paramount for all the other residents. They weren't happy with what was going on. They looked at their records and decided they probably were going to make to us an application, a referral for subletting. And they'd also had a right to acquire the property, which wasn't quite sitting right with them. They weren't happy with that at all. Because it falls under the POSHFA legislation, the right to acquire, we applied to the bank of the individual to have a look at their spend. But where are they? What are they doing? Because if they're not living there, they're going to be living somewhere else. And if they're not spending in relation to living in that property, utilities and things like that, well, who is paying for the utilities? So that showed us that they were pretty much not in that area. We went on again and did the telephone subscription through NAFIN using IPA legislation, and placed them for pretty much 86% of what was 12 to 18 months, I think we got in the end, away from the address, living and working somewhere else. And clearly there was a sublet going on with money going through the financial and the bank accounts. So they were called in for the fraud offences and the offences under the Prevention of Social Housing Fraud Act, interviewed, and almost immediately said, well, can I just sign the property away? I don't want it anymore. So we recovered the property civilly, and as you can see, it was reallocated to a family unit with children who've been on the waiting list for 3 years. The social housing provider took a course of action of not pursue for the criminal matters because that costs money. They're not in the business of prosecuting people or spending money unnecessarily when they've got accommodation that they need to maintain for social housing. So some people would want them to prosecute it. It's about not throwing good money after bad, and their decision was not to. Next slide, please. So, as promised, under the 30 minutes. If there's any questions generally around fraud, I know these slides are coming out with this workbook. I can't reinforce this enough for everyone to have a look at. Michelle, I know you're circulating. Thank you very much. But otherwise, any questions for anybody in relation to fraud?
Thank you. So you did say we'll get a copy of the slides. Yeah.
The slides are going to be circulated in this week's members' information bulletin.
Yeah, I think it's useful, not just for this sort of training, but sort of the training in general that this forms part of this committee. So if any members, not just members of this committee, so it'd be useful just to reinforce that again. Thank you. Any questions? I've got one. You mentioned that you look after 4 authorities, I think. Is that kind of typical amongst the team members within SAFs? Is that sort of an average sort of number?
We're not a typical team. There's one similar that I can say is almost identical to us down in the West Country, Devon shared partnership. Thurrock had something bigger, not necessarily better, but personal opinion. But that's gone on to get bigger and change. So for us, we're split evenly down the middle with the 2 managers. I have the 4 authorities, which are districts. I also look after our financial investigator, which requires me to use certain powers under the Proceeds of Crime Act and be authorised by the National Crime Agency to do work that she does in asset confiscation. So when we run our larger cases where we've got substantial funds at risk, she can freeze accounts and recover money that way, and also do the proceeds of crime in a similar way to the police recover money from organised crime and drugs. And that's exactly the same process. So we've got that capability as well. And on the other side of the house, as it were, the other manager looks after Broxbourne, Hertsmere, our intelligence team function, and then also matters for the county, so Herts County. So we've got 4 areas. Herts County and Luton are pretty much even distribution, and then everything else is sort of picked up in between. So it's quite a lot of work for 2 people, but it's a really good team on both sides supporting all of that work, which is good news.
We saw the list of the members of SAFs. Why aren't there more? Why do you think? What do the sort of authorities who aren't members? What do they do in this regard?
There's always room for more people to join SAFs, so please do spread the word. But early to say, but we do have other interested authorities regularly come to us and say, we're thinking about what we're going to do, what does it look like, how much does it cost, where is it going, and certainly at this stage there's 1 or 2 out there a little bit more interested than others, and we hope that they'll come on board with us. The benefits are huge in the sense that a service that is bespoke to the authority, that has agreed key performance indicators, that deals with all of those other extraneous things that really need a specialism or a specialist to deal with, that tie up business as usual resources away from what they should be doing to deal with events like this. So it's a great model. I think it works very, very well across where we are now. And we'd love to have more partners on board, which means we can recruit more good staff, because there are people out there that want to join us.
So is the alternative just do it in-house, I suppose? For those authorities that aren't members?
Yeah, well, it is. But then you think of where we are. So we have an intelligence team to sift and assess all the referrals that come to us. They also perform a media and comms function. They do compliance work, and they deal with quite a few other things in between as well. And then you've got a trained investigator that has to comply with certain legislation. So you need someone who manages them to be able to know what that legislation is to ensure that they are compliant with it. And then they're preparing files for legal. And then you need that access to legal and legal to work with them on that same basis. And then you need to drive all of that with work coming in constantly. And when we get busy in one authority, we have the capacity to squeeze work to other areas, or if all our investigators get busy, we can push back down to that intel team. And so there's flexibility and capability in all the directions, which individual people working in silos alone will miss out on. And of course, we've got access to all the partner systems with all the appropriate DPAs and ISAs in place to ensure that whilst it's your intelligence, we can look at it, or your information, we can then appropriately share it within that group. So it's a greater benefit for all.
Thank you. Is now an opportunity to talk about the fraud hub? Just give us a little update on that. Or will that come later?
There's a smaller update later. It's still a work in progress. It's being rolled out in some other authorities quicker because of appetite, because of availability of staff, and also IT issues, generally speaking. But it is a great idea. It's the National Fraud Initiative Lite, which happens every 2 years, which involves a huge amount of data and resources for each authority to load that data up to the national system and then process the end product that comes out with a fraud hub, which is just our partners. So all of the people that you saw on there, and obviously Luton, which is out of it is called the Hertfordshire Fraud Hub, but Luton's included. And we can process that data as frequently or as infrequently as each partner wants it done. And then they can deal with those results as they come out. And every 2 years, when the big result comes out, they should be much lower, and the business as usual can carry on without the massive disruption every 2 years of dealing with those reports. So it's a little way off being perfect and up and running here, but the results we're seeing from other places are really good. So I'm sure it will, pay its dividends.
Thank you. Just lastly, we touched on sort of the effects on the council of fraud, and obviously the obvious kind of financial effects. How big a impact would reputational damage to a council be as a result of fraud?
It's a double-edged sword, because if we don't acknowledge that we are going to be the victims, or potentially the victims of fraud, or people are going to try their luck and take money from us, then we won't have those proper procedures in place to stop it in the first place. When we identify it and we pursue it and we deal with people properly and effectively, and we publicise that, it generally sends out not a negative message of reputational risk, a highly positive message of, well, that's what council should be doing. They've identified people who have committed fraud. They've identified that they've taken the money from them. They've been prosecuted, and they're going to recover that money because the council take it seriously, because it's my money, your money, everybody else's money that's being paid to the council to look after it and keep it safe. And that message, on a recent case for the county, has seen nothing but great publicity, and it's quite a high profile one. So, that's the general reaction that we get.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? Well, thank you. Well, if there aren't any other questions, thank you very much indeed for the training. That was really, really useful. Thank you. And we'll get copies of the A5, the booklet, and the slides too. Thank you. So if we're happy to move on, then we're on to your report, and your full report for 21-22, which begins on page 16 of our pack.
So good evening again, Chair and members. The Shared Entry Fraud Service, or SAFS as I've been referring to it for the last half hour, is a shared service that, for those that don't know, the council was a founding member of in 2015, and we're proud of that association with the council. SAFS provides a counter-fraud function for this council, and also 6 others, as I've already explained in the training, across hearts and beds. The report before you provides details of the work of both the council and SAFS in 2021 and 2022 to deter and prevent fraud against the council. Just a little bit of background about SAFS for the new committee members that are here this evening. As you've seen already in the training, there's a variety of functions that we can provide for the council, helping develop policies and processes to deter fraud, delivering fraud awareness training for staff, identifying new fraud risks, the use of data and data analytics to target fraud quickly, public and internal communications to help prevent fraud, and finally, investigation and prosecution where necessary, where all other defences have failed. We also help design an anti-fraud plan for the council each year to ensure the council acknowledges and understands the risks of fraud and corruption it faces and has in place measures to mitigate and/or manage those risks. Having an anti-fraud plan and a robust response is essential for any organisation, as it allows us to consider the areas of the council most at risk of fraud and target our available resources. Being able to prevent fraud is the first place in our priority, but understanding how and why fraud happens is also key to building an effective response. There is a copy of the 2021-22 anti-fraud plan for the council at Appendix A, the plan having been approved by this committee back in March 2021. So turning to the fraud report itself, pages 16 through 31 of your bundle, as I think was just mentioned. The anti-fraud plan for 21-22 is mentioned in a bit more detail at page 19, paragraph 2.1, and the plan can be found at Appendix A. As usual for restarts, we deployed one counter-fraud officer to work exclusively for the council in 2021 and 22. That officer is managed by SAFS, by myself in fact, and has access to SAFS intelligence, data analytics and financial investigation expertise at all times. During 2021 and 22, we worked closely with the East Herts officers on a review of anti-fraud policies for publication in this year. They'll be subject to another report, not this evening. We're also working with the council's HR team to update a number of fraud-related e-training packages, which are shared generally with the wider partnership of SAFS. Training was also delivered in last year on general fraud awareness, the National Anti-Fraud Service, and services provided by the Cabinet Office. The effects of COVID continued to impact on our work throughout last year. SAFS was well placed in its working practices to be able to minimise this impact. However, some areas were out of our control, and they can be found detailed at page 21, paragraph 2.16. They include working with the DWP, remote access to partner systems for relevant SAFS staff, deployment and refocusing of staff to deal with the COVID response, special measures in dealing with interviews of witnesses and subjects of investigation, and a reduced capacity and progression of cases within the criminal justice system. However, SAFS resources were deployed to prevent a response to fraud with a compliance approach to low-level fraud and priority given to the more serious allegations, as well as the various COVID grant schemes administered by the council, which are referenced at page 22, paragraph 2.18 to 2.20. One of our biggest aims is to help prevent fraud occurring, and working with numerous agencies, we issued 20 fraud and cyber alerts to the council last year. The reporting of fraud declined last year, and I think there's a graph on page 23 for you, and that's compared to various years. We feel that staff working from home may have resulted in some loss of visibility for SAFS and generally all things fraud, and that's reflected in some other partners. This year, we're working hard to improve our presence across all council services and continue to build on the council's anti-fraud culture, including in respect of housing admission fraud. Last year, SAFS closed 19 cases in the year, of which 17 resulted in recoverable losses of around £100,000 and ongoing fraud savings for the next 12 months of £80,000. 27 cases remained under investigation and carried forward to this year, and there's an estimated loss of £100,000 for those 27 cases. 4 tenancy cases, tenancy fraud cases affecting social housing partners, providers, in East Herts, were investigated, 2 of which were recovered and again led to families from the council's housing register. SAF supported council officers with dealing with their NFI matches, and some very good results are in process from that. At page 28, you'll find the key performance indicators for SAFs. These were agreed as part of the plan for 21-22. I'm pleased to advise this committee that working closely with officers from the council, we were able to achieve or exceed all but one of our targets for the year. And I think we missed that very narrowly, and that relates to training. At page 29, there is an update of our work to date for the first quarter of this year, including the work on the revised policies. A further 21 allegations have been reported to SAFs and 34 investigations are currently live. Work with the council's communications team to drive reporting from the public and training are underway, and that also includes an anti-money laundering program. It's a new function taken on by SAFs. We will become the council's reporting line for any concerns over money laundering. At page 30, you'll see the fraud data the council is required to publish as part of the Transparency Code. And at that point, Chair and members, I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Thank you. On page 24, we've got a two tables. There's a sort of total fraud referrals, and then there's sort of underneath there's those that failed referrals, essentially, on page 24. It's para 2.26 and 2.27. So in 21-22, it looks like roughly half of the referrals kind of failed for one reason or another. Is that number kind of a typical sort of roughly half of referrals tend not to go anywhere?
We take a lot of referrals from the public, and because of their position, they don't actually quite understand what they're trying to refer in and whether it's the right team that can deal with it. Often the information is quite sparse, and there's just no way of us developing it. And that's what the intelligence team is there to do, is to identify what we can progress and what we can't. If we can't progress it because it's not our remit, then we will pass it on to the appropriate team to pursue. But because of the nature of the availability and the ease in which we encourage fraud to be reported to us, which we would never discourage, we do get some that are incomplete and insufficient information, and it's fairly consistent across all partners.
Thank you. Councillor Bell, and then Councillor.
On page 29, 4.3, it says that between April and June, there's been an estimated fraud loss of 213,000. Is that roughly proportionate to the size of the council in comparison to other local authorities as well, and what they tend to have lost over the same period?
The first thing to say is how we do the estimate, so you have an understanding. So for a housing fraud application, the cost to the council for keeping someone in temporary accommodation, a national figure has been published of £18,000. So it may not have cost the council £18,000 for the period, but we have to put some estimate on it because we've been asked to do that by the partners. And the same for a housing benefit and council tax reduction. There's a multiplier that's used of about 12 months. So these estimated figures are an estimate, but allow us, more importantly, to identify areas where we may need to do some more work, because that estimate gives us a clue of how much money is at risk. But it's not definitive, but it is comparable to similar sized authorities with an area. I have to say, East Arts is very good in that we have a lot of reports that actually are either in the process of being stopped, or they're alive to, or we get on it very quickly. So just because it says that, it doesn't necessarily mean that's what it's going to look like in next year's report.
I know it wasn't so much about the money, because obviously the calculations will be the same for the other local authorities as well. But it's just I think useful to get an idea of whether we've got sort of more cases than, say, North Herts, for example, who will have, obviously you'll be calculating it similarly for them as you will for us. So
there is parity, and there is an ongoing debate amongst the people that we work with at the council, from North Herts, East Herts and Stevenage, as to why Why is it different there? And how do we explain that? And why do we not see those types of frauds? And why do you? So whilst the figures are comparable, that the types and commission of the fraud, actually, when you think how similar the areas at first flush appear to be, when we're looking at fraud, they're actually quite disparate. We struggle sometimes to draw comparisons, but on the figures, it's about right.
Thank you. Just would you be able to provide a bit of clarity on page 27, 2.33, where it says the council did not make good use of the council tax review framework. And then, but later on also where it says work with colleagues in the finance team at county council to ensure that all contractual costs for the 2022 framework are reimbursed.
So there's an apology there from us. I did speak to Michelle earlier. Unfortunately, you've picked up on the one typo in the report. The word good should not be paragraph 2.33. So the council did not make use of the council tax review that we run because it did one itself. It's already got a contract to do that. And then the second point was, sorry?
Just the second half of it. So does that mean that
All right, there's
the reimbursement? So
yeah.
is
So
that because now
you didn't use it?
we didn't use
Yes,
it? Okay.
apologies
But
for the
going
word good,
forward,
yes.
we will be using it.
I'm not sure on that because you've got the shared service between here and Stevenage. There is a little bit of autonomy as to how they run it. We do have the fraud hub, and I think there are other things in the pipeline that perhaps not within my gift to start talking about, but there are other things with the Revs and Ben service that may mean that the fraud hub may take over, or they may keep with their provider of choice, which goes out to a contract. I think they were already tied down to a provision of a contract and couldn't get out of that. That's why we didn't use it.
Okay, thank you.
On page 25, you talked about your money laundering work. And could you just give us a bit of a flavour on what sort of work you do on money laundering? And also, does the council need to have a policy on money? If so, do you assist with that?
That is one of the policies that we're working on. So councils are not in the regulated sector like financial institutions and banks and so forth, where they have to have an anti-money laundering reporting officer. But all of the best practice from SIPFA and CIFAS and everybody else is that they should have one. The amount of use they would get is quite minimal, but the expertise that's required and the qualification and the training is overwhelming to the amount of use. So we've conducted that training in-house between myself, the other council fraud manager, and Nick, and within all our partners at board level, it's been agreed that we will take over that function. And the examples of money laundering that a council might see is sometimes where a council has stock and someone's been overpaying their rent for their council house, and there's 10 or 15, 20,000 pounds sometimes on some of these rent accounts, and then you suddenly realise also that HB is in payment, and we don't quite understand why they're overpaying their rent if they have recourse to a need for HB. So to pay that money away may leave the council open to a money laundering allegation. So we would then have a look at that. We'd certainly be looking at it for a number of different reasons, but that's one of them. So that's a very simple explanation of why that's there. It's about also the purchase of money, purchase of land. So if you have a parcel of land that the council wants to sell and they're about to take some money from somebody and you're not happy with who that individual is and you want some compliance around that, then that could be referred to us as a concern over money laundering, because we don't want to be, as in the council does not want to be, the recipient of any tainted finances.
So did you say you're kind of working on a policy or set of guidelines or something? The other thing I'd just like to ask before you come back is, you mentioned if there was an instance where somebody was overpaying on their rent, for instance, and it might be suspicious, would the council be held to account if they didn't kind of spot it? And if enough wasn't done to spot something like that?
Because they're not in the regulated sector, that wouldn't, they wouldn't be, it would be bad practice, especially if HB was in payment and you're thinking, why is that money there? Well, let's just take housing benefit out for a second, and it's just someone's overpaying on their rent account or on their council tax account or whatever they're paying the money to, and request the money to come back to them. The fact that it's sitting there wouldn't be a money laundering issue per se, because you're not a regulated sector. If you paid the money back without thinking, and the test is quite low, why have they ever paid that? That's not a normal thing to do. What do we know about our customer? Is there any potential that this could be money from the proceeds of criminality, whatever that may be? Then you paid that money back to them, then there could be an allegation of money laundering. So that would, by us doing the checks and balances, we prevent the council from falling into that allegation of money laundering. And in short, the process is called a DAML. It's a defence against money laundering. So the policy that's coming has attached to it a reporting form in clear, simple, plain English, and anyone at the council can make that report to us and say, we're concerned about paying this money away from the council, or we're concerned about the money being received into the council because of, and it can be very, very simple, and we will investigate their concern and give some assurance around it. And if we find things that we're not happy with, then we'll create an investigation and take it from there. The very simplest explanation I can give you of a money laundering circumstances, which sounds crazy but was actually true, was a bank teller at the counter that wanted to make a money laundering report because the man that kept coming in on a Friday afternoon with lots of cash, had dirty fingernails and smelt funny. He was growing cannabis, and she wanted to report it, and her manager said no. And she then went ahead and made the report, and then they found a massive cannabis factory and the man was arrested and things like that. So from the most innocuous and silly reasons of making those reports may come quite interesting and large cases. And at the end of the day, it just has given that additional assurance. Yeah, that's fine. We know who that person is. We can do the research around the finances and the accounts and the individual, and it's there. And it stops, again, someone else having to step out from business to use it or do something which is potentially outside their comfort zone.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Well, yeah. Okay, well, thank you again. I think we probably exhausted our questions. So we go back to page 16 of our pack, and we're recommended to review the council's work to combat fraud in 21-22. I think we've done. We're also reviewing the performance of Southsea meeting its KPIs in 21-22, which you alluded to earlier in your presentation, which is on page 28 of our papers, which is paragraph 3 of your report. And as you quite rightly said, you've done pretty well in meeting the KPIs, apart from the one small little red mark on there. But I think in the scheme of things, that wasn't so bad at all. So I think we can certainly sort of say that we reviewed that and congratulate you on how well you've done in terms of meeting your KPIs during the year. Well, I think they're just recommendations. We don't need to vote on those, do we? So I think we'll be finished. Thank you very much indeed for very, really interesting presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members. May I be excused?
You're very welcome to stay, or alternatively, you could go back out into the heat.
Whilst it's tempting to remain, I have other things to attend to. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, very nice to see you. Again, give our very best wishes to Nick.
We will do. Thank you for those.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Brilliant. Okay, so we're on to shared internal audit, I think, which is on page 38.
Thank you, Chair. This is the first of the internal audit progress reports for 2022-23. The key points I wanted to draw to your attention are the final reports issued since April earlier this year. These are shown in the table in paragraph 2.2 at the bottom of page 40 of your pack. Members should perhaps note the 4 audits and that there are positive assurance levels attached to those. Over the page and in detail in Appendix A, members can see there are a number of other audits in progress. The outcome of these will, of course, be reported in the usual way, and that will include sending members of the committee a copy audit report and the management response when that's received. Moving on, I can confirm that to date there hasn't been any amendments to the original internal audit plan approved by the committee in April. It's still relatively early in the year, so perhaps there have been few opportunities to change the plan. If there are any as the year progresses, I'll highlight them to you in subsequent progress reports. On page 46, details of the outstanding high priority audit recommendations. There are just two at present relating to payment card industry data security standards, both the same audit. I had hoped that either Stephen or I would be able to give you an update as implied in the report. Unfortunately, neither of us have had that update. So my suggestion, apologies for that, is that we circulate something to you by email after the meeting in the next few days.
That'd be great, please. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Other than that, subject to any questions that members have got, that's my report. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions on? So you seem to be broadly in sort of where you think you should be for this time of the year in terms of your work program. So things are going. I think we've discussed about the fact that the number of audit days has kind of been reduced a bit. I think you've been questioned. I think this has come up at previous meetings, and things seem to be working okay. In terms of, also, in terms of the way you conduct your audit, there was, I can't think what the name of it was now. Stephen was very keen on it. And in terms of some technology that was going to help us streamline the process, is that kind of coming on? Is that being used yet?
Imagine Stephen was referring to something called data analytics. We have embedded that in our work. It isn't used on every audit. It's essentially lends itself to those audits where you've got a large data set. That data set is downloaded and then analysed from a number of different perspectives. And that's a far more effective way of looking at sort of the whole audit population rather than a small number of transactions for sample testing purposes. The approach we've adopted with our audit staff is that we expect data analytics to be applied to all audits unless there is a good reason not to. And part of the audit methodology includes the requirement for them to document why they haven't used it. Typically, there's not a data set or it's not particularly practical for that particular audit. In terms of sort of where we are as a whole, you're quite right. The number of audit days in 2022-23 dropped down from 300 to 250. We have previously commented on that at the committee. In terms of where we are with our work programme as a whole, we're probably a few audits behind the curve at the moment. The main reason for that is, like a lot of audit services, we are currently experiencing recruitment and retention challenges. We've got Advert out at the moment, covering practically every level within our structure. So hopefully we'll bring that back on course as the year progresses.
That's interesting. That seems to be a blight for the councils across the board, isn't it, in terms of retaining staff?
Yeah, I mean, speaking to colleagues around councils, we're certainly not the exception to the norm. Many, particularly the professional disciplines, if I can describe them in that way, seem to be having issues around recruitment and retention, some of which, you know, it's often been the case, such as within finance and planning and development, but lawyers, auditors as well at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're in a position where there don't seem to be any sort of high or critical items that are outstanding at the moment, which is one of the things we would be noting if there were any. So which is good, isn't it? I guess from the council's point of view, there are a couple of mediums, but nothing higher than that.
No, it is just the two in that appendix. Other work that we've done of late has almost exclusively attracted positive assurance opinions. Probably the only one in the pipeline, which is the exception to that, it relates to cybersecurity.
Is that the one we've been waiting for a bit?
It is.
Yeah, I'll come to that. Yeah.
By good fortune, coincidence, we've had the management response quite late this afternoon. So I'll be circulating the outcome of that to members in the next day or two.
Thank you. Yeah, on the page 40, it mentions there's a medium priority recommendation under asset management. Is that? Did I miss that? Is that would that be on? Would that have been highlighted in one of the appendices? I know certainly the payment card one is. There's two payment card things mentioned there, aren't there? You see it on the bottom of page 40. There's a
yes, the appendix where it shows the payment card industry data security. We only report high priority recommendations to members.
Thank you. Sorry. Okay. Don't know if there are any other points to raise. It's only as far as what we're recommending. If that's okay to move to page 38, go back to that. So we're noting internal audit progress report. I think we're happy to do that. And there aren't any critical or high priority recommendations to note the status of, I don't think. So it's just really to note, we can note that, I guess. Do we need to vote on that? So Rishi, you've proposed and seconded. Sophie, thank you. All those in favour? Thank you. That was very straightforward. Thank you very much indeed, Simon, for that. That's very kind of you. And we look forward to seeing the cyber stuff in due course. Thank you. Thank you. Community value. Page 51.
Thank you, Chairman. So was he saving the best items till last?
I was going to say that.
I think in terms of why this report's here, I think we had an audit done a number of years ago which suggested it was good practice for this committee or an equivalent committee in a district council to have an oversight of what's going on with this bit of legislation, as the district council has a statutory responsibility to keep the register up, and that's why it's here. Although I noticed the last report was September of last year, which was the first one I've taken here. It doesn't seem that long ago, and I do remember writing it, and that report was quite detailed. So what I've attempted to do this year is a much reduced version, which outlines a bit of background about the legislation itself, what's changed since last year, and then provides a link to the current register as is. So I think I talked at the last year about this legislation from the Localism Act being essentially designed to protect local assets, mostly things like village shops and village pubs, from closing. It would allow the community an extra level of protection if a landowner does want to sell any of these local assets. A local community group has the ability to raise some funds and purchase them before it goes on the open market. So it's very good in theory, and it's all backed up with the legislation. I think the reality is it's quite weak as a mechanism to capture sort of community control, because if a landlord doesn't want to sell to a local group, they're not compelled to do so. It also doesn't stop a landlord, if they want to convert a pub or a shop to residential, it doesn't stop that process. It merely delays it, and of course that's been a bigger risk in the district for a number of years. However, as I always advise local groups that are facing this situation, it will certainly do no harm to have something listed as an asset of community value. And if that frustrates the local landowner of the asset, that might be enough in terms of achieving your objectives. So that's the kind of background to the legislation. One thing I have noticed since last year, I mentioned that there wasn't really a database nationally of what was happening. But there is now an organisation called the Plunkett Group that have some money from Deluxe to maintain a national database. So last year they hadn't sort of done that, but they have now done that. And I provided the link in the paper there. If you go onto their website, that will give you a list of every single asset across all the local authorities in the country that are listed. And obviously it pulls out data from the different websites. That's quite helpful in understanding what's going on. What's less clear is how many of those assets have actually been bought by the local community and then run. I think there are still to date, difficult to get information, but you're looking at a dozen or so. It's still very small numbers. So actually bringing this legislation through to fruition in terms of getting community groups to take on assets is still very challenging, particularly when you've got landlords that are keen to convert to resi or just sell their shop or pub or whatever it may be. So at the time of writing, we've got 26 assets in the district. They're available on our website. All the dates of when they were listed are there as well. There's one change to that website at the moment. So the Countryman Inn, which is just outside Buntingford, as you're heading up towards Royston, it's that nice pub on the right. It's been shut for the last 2 years since before COVID. That's listed. The landowner has now given notice to sell, so I need to update the website. That was done a couple of weeks ago. I've also mentioned in the paper at the time of writing, we had a number of other assets going through the process of being listed. So we've got the nomination forms, we're going through them, and they're listed at 2.15 in the report. So we've now confirmed all those will be put on the asset of community registers. Community register. The one thing to highlight there is Lay Parkland in Much Haddam, which I'm not familiar with it, but I'm told there's a kind of field in a meadow with public access across it. We decided to list that, not a problem. Then alerted the land registry to say this has now got an ACV registration on it. Can you update the title deed in case anybody decides to sell it, because they can't do it. A sale was already in progress, so we're unable to do that. It looks like the landowner beat us to it and decided to sell that. I'm not sure whether it's gone to one individual or whether they've carved it up into smaller parcels of land equal. Either of those could be possible. We're waiting to find out. So unfortunately that was null and void, and we contacted the parish council to say whoever the new owner is, if you want to re-register it, you can do so. Just send us all the forms. So just thought I'd highlight that. And I think that's kind of it. As I say, the committee are asked to note the report.
Thank you. Thank you. It's very, very comprehensive. We talked about us sort of reminding groups when these assets was coming up, when the sort of listing was coming up for sort of expiry. Are we having to? Are we sort of having to do that?
Sorry, Chair, I should have mentioned that was the last thing. Yes, out of last year's meeting, there was a recommendation to make sure that we are alerting the local ward members when stuff is coming up for renewal or when items are being registered. So I believe now that is happening. I've certainly been in contact with local members. Looking around the room, I don't think any assets in the wards being represented this evening have been listed the last couple of years, which is why you may not have heard from myself or Esther Piper. But I believe we've now got that into the process. But if it's not happening, do please let me know.
There seem to be a few that are kind of looming on this list, aren't there? A bit sort of in the next few months. We're going into early next year.
Yes. So when we get to about 3 or 4 months away, we'll let the ward member know, and that's what's recently happened with a couple of assets in Walken. We alerted Councillor Crofton, and they were subsequently renominated.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's really useful for us to see this. And I certainly think if we could continue to see this sort of once a year, I think that would be useful. I think that works for you. I think members, would you agree? I think it's quite useful for us to have sight of this. Just sort of keep an eye on it. Thank you. Are there any questions? I think the report's very self-explanatory. I think it covers the subject extremely well. So the proposal on page 51 is just for us to review the register and comment on any issues regarding assets of community value. I mean, I don't think there are any issues. I mean, I think the question about just sort of contacting board members is one that we're quite keen for you to do, which probably you are doing, but that would be the one thing I think I would just like to highlight. Okay, if you could. Okay, well, I think that's done. Thank you, Ben. Thanks very much indeed. Again, you're welcome, very welcome to stay. We're nearly there, actually. So if we're moving on, it's the work program, which is on page, or begins on page 64. I don't think it's changed from last time. I don't think it has. And we've got this situation where we're never quite sure when the accounts are going to, when the auditors are going to decide they've completed the audit. And so it keeps getting pushed back to the next meeting. You'll see, so the approval of the statement of accounts, etc., are normally on the September agenda, but who knows? So we just need to see how that goes. And then you'll see that there's some training on the statement of accounts at that meeting too, and I guess the two would go hand in hand. So depending on whether the auditors are ready to come back to us on the audit for the next meeting, then I guess we'll have the training then on that subject as well. I noticed that at the moment there's no training for the November meeting. So if maybe we can have a think about what we think might be useful for us to have if there's a gap. I wonder whether there might be any governance related training.
I was going to suggest, Chair, if the committee arguably have a role in relation to obtaining assurance around cybersecurity. Technical subject potentially, but depending on how it's approached, it may be something that they wish to consider.
So who would
I think when you look at some of the material presented by the National Cybersecurity Centre, they produce material directed to boards and committees. They pose 5 key questions that committees and boards should be asking their Chief Information Security Officer, they define it as. I don't know that we have anyone specifically with that job title, but there will be someone in IT who has that responsibility, even if it's the head of that service. So I guess that's probably the first port of call, but it's something I can make queries about if there's appetite.
I think that'd be really useful. I think you would agree that with that members. I think that would be, if we could do it, that would be really good. I think. Yes, please, if you wouldn't mind. Would you mind making that put in the minutes? Do we agree that that's quite a good idea to do? We've got a slot certainly for November, and that seems like a very good time to have this training. If you, that would be great. Okay, thank you. I think apart from that, I think the work program is what it is. I think it's substantially the same as it's in before. So are we happy to approve the work program, subject to maybe adding some cyber-related training in November? I mean, then we'll keep an eye on see whether the accounts go back to us in September or not. Okay, so we need a vote on that. Councillor Bell is proposing, Councillor Fernando is seconding. Those all in favour? I think that's unanimous. Thank you. Well, I think that could well be that. I don't think there are any other items that might be considered to be urgent. So we've all got to go back into the hot weather again. Well, I think this meeting's closed. Thank you. Thanks ever so much for everybody for coming. And good luck on your journey home. Thank you.